This is your reality check.
Welcome to The Reality Check, the weekly Canadian show that explores a wide range of controversies and curiosities using science and critical thinking. Today is March 12th. I'm producer Pat, and with me is Christina Roach.
Hey, everyone.
We have two interesting segments for you today. Adam's going to talk to us about biased algorithms. First, Christina, you're going to talk to us about subtitles and learning to read.
Yeah, so Pat recently showed me a video that went viral of Stephen Fry doing a PSA. If you don't know him, Fry is a notable English actor, comedian, and writer. He's also a well-known and self-ascribed skeptic. Fry kicks off the video with a riddle that goes, what takes 10 seconds, costs nothing, but could help change your child's life forever? Ooh. The answer, simply, just turn on the subtitles, people. If you think the suggestion, help change your kids' lives forever, sounds a bit like puffery, shout out to episode 531. Hold that thought. As cited at turnonthesubtitles.org, turning on the subtitles while children are watching television can double the chances of a child becoming good at reading.
Wow.
This specific stat is based on an Indian Institute of Management academic study of 2,350 children. Quote, 34% became good readers with schooling alone, but when exposed to 30 minutes a week of subtitled film songs, that proportion more than doubled to 70%. Now, this isn't a lone wolf study. There's extensive global research showing how effective turning on the subtitles is. A little bit about turnonthesubtitles.org from their website. Now, this isn't a company. This isn't a charity. This is just some like-minded people who think this idea is so blindingly obvious that it just has to happen. I wasn't kidding when I said a little bit about the company. That's literally their About section on their website. Many quote-unquote famous people like Fry are helping spread the word, and the collective's effort is supported by advisory panels of experts with very impressive pedigrees and expertise in literacy and language learning, cognitive development, education specialists, and more. The site compiles a ton of research, so it's all in one place for you, and it breaks it down into different sections with questions. So as an example, how do subtitles aid reading? Then they break that down further and cite specific studies to back up each claim. By the way, I don't know if this is my imagination, but the layout and font and subtitling they use in their articles really feels like the article is much easier to read and comprehend. I'd imagine there's some research behind that as well. To say the research into same language subtitling link is comprehensive is really an understatement. They list considerable citations, which makes my life easier. And for the sake of time, I cherry-picked a couple of studies to cover. And as always, we invite you to dig deeper into our show notes at trcpodcast.com.
That is a great website.
It is great. Now let's dig into the example I mentioned earlier. How subtitles aid reading. One of the ways cited is subtitles cause automatic reading behavior among children and adults. A Belgian prof named Gerry van Utrieve de Duval. I did look up the pronunciation and I did my best, okay? Anyways, this gentleman is considered to be the pioneer in, quote, proving subtitles will be read inescapably and automatically. And he has a laundry list of publications on the topic. I have to pause here. I went to take a peek at the link to a list of his publications, curious as to how extensive it was. And there was well over 100 citations, most of them peer-reviewed. And one study I found fascinating involves eye-tracking research. Americans are observed watching an American movie with English subtitles. So Americans watching an English language movie that's American, okay? Americans don't tend to be as familiar with subtitles as Europeans or Canadians, for example. But despite this, during the study, they spent, quote, considerable time in the subtitled area of the screen.
Do they actually talk about Americans not having as much exposure to subtitles? Because you would think that at least some states would have subtitles in Spanish.
It's a good question, and they do say that when they're talking about the studies at turnonthesubtitles.org.
That Americans have less exposure. Right, okay.
So, Pat, would you guess that being more exposed to subtitles might make you pay more attention to them?
I mean, that would make logical sense, I guess.
Me too. That's what you'd think, that if your whole life you're used to subtitling, you might pay a little bit more attention. But in this case, they don't find subtitle reading habit forming just because of long-term exposure to subtitling.
Okay.
Now, there was a part 2 to this experiment. This time they showed Dutch-speaking people a movie in Dutch with Dutch subtitles. The researchers found, quote, they, as in the Dutch, also looked extensively at the subtitles, suggesting that reading subtitles is preferred because of efficiency in following and understanding the movie. Evidence of such eye tracking enables us to attribute possible learning outcomes to the subtitles. Another key to fluency in reading is practice. Duh. Practice, practice, practice. Here's an excerpt from a 2010 study from Frey and Fisher. When we experience something, neurons fire. Repeated firings lead to physical changes in the brain that over time and with repetition become more permanent. The challenge, of course, with automaticity is to not allow repetition to turn into a rut. Which segues nicely into another key finding. High interest content drives learning. That's not really surprising to me. I'm sure it's not surprising to you as well, Pat. Yeah. I linked to a YouTube video from John Cabrilli, a leader in cognitive neuroscience at MIT, and he explains how motivation and emotion, quote, propel learning very powerfully. It makes sense. If a child feels inherently motivated to watch a show with same language subtitling on, the visual and auditory pathways involved in reading get stronger over time as a byproduct.
That makes sense.
A 2001 US-based study titled Learning to Read from Television, The Effects of Using Captions and Narration, published in the Journal of Educational Psychology, says, the present study indicated that beginning readers recognize more words when they view television that uses captions. The combination of captions and sound help children identify the critical story elements in the video clips. In sum, television captions, by evoking efforts to read, appeared to help a child focus on central story elements. So I guess the big question is whether SLS exposure really does actually improve reading skills. I learned that the idea of using subtitles to improve reading skills actually dates back to closed caption TV. In 1986, the National Captioning Institute conducted studies to determine the feasibility of teaching reading to hearing students using closed caption materials. So this isn't a totally new idea, but there has been a lack of longitudinal studies until now. TurnOnTheSubtitles.org details many different studies, including an SLS project in India with some promising data from longitudinal studies. In 2014, Kathari and Bandyopadhyay were finally able to assess the research compiled over 5 years to evaluate the impact SLS may have had on participants. Now, the study involved participants watching nationally televised weekly hour-long shows featuring Hindi film songs. The groups were split up into high SLS viewing group, obviously more subtitling, and a low SLS group. Now, this is absolutely wild. Quote, among school children who could not read a single letter in Hindi at the baseline 2002, 70% in the high SLS viewing group became functional readers by the end line 2007 as compared to 34% in the low SLS group.
Wow.
In the 15 plus age group, 14% in the high SLS and 5% in the low SLS group went from non-decoding to functional reading. Adults gained too, but children benefited substantially more in what can be described as a schooling plus SLS effect. They also did an experiment in Maharashtra state, broadcasting SLS on around 20 films per week for 2 years. In brief, the annual status of education report independently found that over those 2 years, 9% more grade 5 kids could read a grade 2 level text compared to no gain nationally. And 30% more kids in early grades achieved basic reading ability. Again, there are many, many studies cited if you're interested in learning more. Now, a 2012 study from New Zealand and Australia illustrated, quote, by using subtitles of popular movies and associated literacy activities, both reading achievement and engagement are enhanced, particularly for diverse and low-achieving students. Same language subtitling, SLS, appears to evoke unavoidable reading mileage where reading skills are practiced subconsciously. In conclusion, I learned that almost everyone, whether a struggling reader, a noob, or fluent, we just can't ignore same language subtitling. We will just automatically lock into it. And in the process, the research shows our reading skills really do improve. As for any parents out there, Stephen Fry says you don't even have to tell your kids that you turned on the subtitles. They probably won't even notice. Having raised a kid, I guarantee that's probably true. It's certainly not going to hurt them. So checkers, why not turn on your subtitles and see how it goes?
That's fascinating. And the gains that they're quoting in some of these studies are huge.
Oh my gosh. And it was just study after study after study. And again, studies that were over quite a period of time in developing countries and in underdeveloped countries. It's incredible. And it's, as Stephen Fry says, 10 seconds. It's free. Why not?
Fascinating. Thanks, Christina. And with that, we'll turn it over to Adam. I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon.
Stay classy and not smartassy, and please stay safe.
What's up, cuboids? Algorithms sure are tricky. It's hard to avoid them when using the internet. But how they work is always a bit mysterious to us. I've stumbled upon a few cases where algorithms were being accused of bias lately, so I wanted to discuss some of these. They don't totally relate, but none of them were sort of a full segment, so I just wanted to kind of talk about them at the same time. Now, one example of this is something I stumbled upon in December, but which had been around since the fall. Now, the issue is racist cropping algorithms on Twitter. So a tweet I saw read, "Quick test to see if Twitter's cropping algorithm is still racist." So cropping meaning showing only a small portion of a photo to highlight that photo as sort of a preview. Now, there were 2 images of a white woman included with this tweet. If you click on those photos, it turns out that that's just half of a split-screened image with a black man and a white woman on each picture, but their positions are reversed. Now, Twitter, rather than simply cropping the photo so that the middle of the image is visible and focusing on pretty much what would be a line between 2 split screens, something uninteresting, it focuses on one of the 2 faces, which in this case was the face of a white person. The response by the original poster was, "Yup, still racist." My mind immediately went to, well, what's the algorithm really looking for here? So some assume that it might be contrast. Now, this, it would seem, is an oversimplification, but a few other images showed very different results. So in this case, the images of both the black and white woman had a dark background. Other photos of black and white people in front of white backgrounds tended to crop around the black person. Similarly, if the background of the original image was tweaked so that it was actually white with the same actual pictures of the faces, the image then crops with a focus on the black man. So, is the algorithm actually racist? Well, I still don't know because I've only seen some cherry-picked examples. Now, the issue first came to prominence in September when a user posted a Zoom screenshot of himself and a black coworker, which cropped only to him. So, again, same thing, a picture with 2 people, not sort of in the same frame, 2 different pictures, and it chooses to focus on one and not the other. But he was posting the screenshot complaining about how Zoom was not detecting the black man's face. So, perhaps whatever problem Zoom had was similar to the problem Twitter had. Now, this was different. This was about how Zoom takes out certain backgrounds and decides what's your face. And anyone who's been on Zoom or Teams calls knows that this doesn't always work perfectly. So I thought this wasn't a great example. The black man is sitting in front of a window in broad daylight, so it's very hard to make out any details of his face. Whether he was black or white, that would have been the case. Perhaps more so because he is dark-skinned and it is a light background, a bright white background. He could have been a mannequin or a plastic toy for all you can tell by the details that you can see in this picture. The white person has walls behind him, his face is more well lit, and the room he's in is just sort of better for doing a call. So if all those lighting situations had been equal, would Twitter still have focused more on the white person than the black person? We don't know. It wasn't a very well-controlled experiment. The reaction to this from Twitter was to apologize profusely for getting it wrong. They said they used machine learning to decide how to crop images and that they attempted to test for bias in various ways. So they tried to test for white-black, white Indian, white Asian, and male-female bias specifically. They said that they didn't find any racial or gender bias. But then they say that they recognize that the way they crop photos means a potential for harm. So that's kind of a vague statement. So it doesn't sound like their algorithm actually is biased, simply that even if they randomly selected to crop one picture over another, they're bound to upset some people, and therefore it is potentially bad. Now, I'm not discounting the possibility that there is a bias, but it hasn't been demonstrated, and Twitter claims that there aren't any based on the data that they're using. The point is that without any bias to the algorithm, even if it was just randomly choosing any face to center, we would be bound to end up leading to the perception of racism, which could then be cherry-picked to demonstrate that this is the case. So what Twitter is deciding to do is to not use that algorithm. Might be a good call on their part, but there's no sort of objectively correct answer here. That's their judgment call they're making. They've basically vowed to make their cropping algorithm less intelligent and make more of an effort to show the whole image rather than trying to determine what's the important part to focus on. Now, image cropping isn't life or death, but we should want it to be relatively free of bias. There are, of course, more serious uses of algorithms where racial bias can be more dangerous, like credit checks, parole decisions, all things like that. So we had friend of the show, Dallas Card, on back in 2017, where he talked about this. With AI and algorithms becoming more and more commonplace, this topic is frequently discussed, and it is getting more serious attention, and it should be getting more serious attention. So we can ask questions like, is the data biased, and is that going to make the algorithm biased? Is the data accurate? And even if it is, can the algorithm still have some bias? And if so, why? And what does that mean? These are important questions which people should be asking, should be looking into. So putting that aside, some more recent examples of Google seemingly intentionally biased their algorithms, and people have been sharing these. The first, a seemingly rather bizarre result, was images of black people showing up in Google searches for white people in a few different ways. Now, Google's algorithms aren't very transparent, and even if they were, I doubt many of us would be able to understand the logic behind them. Now, the searches I saw were a bit odd. One was a Google image search for black men, which returned images of black men, and then one for white men, which returned, well, images of black and white men. Seems a little odd, but I didn't find it all that surprising when I thought about it for just a moment. But I did check DuckDuckGo as a control to see if there was a difference, and the results were mixed. So there were a lot more white people in the white men search on DuckDuckGo, but there were still some black people there. It's important to at least attempt to understand what the algorithm is doing. A lot of the photos of black men, for example, had a white background. So these were usually stock photos. And if you check the description, they might include words like white background or white shirt. So yes, the word men is there, and the word white is in the description. So while those are not white men, we can understand why the search might find them, right? This is a search not being perfect and not perfectly understanding maybe what words are being put in there, but we understand why it does that. Is there an algorithm bias which is trying not to find white men? Well, maybe, but I can't say that's been proven one way or another, at least in this case, especially when we don't know exactly how the algorithm works. So I tried a few variations, and when I did a Google image search for white women, the first result was a picture of Rachel Dolezal, which I thought was pretty funny. So Rachel Dolezal, for reference, is a transracial woman who claims to be black even though she is white. So there was some controversy over that a few years ago. We did talk about it on the show. So the other thing which I saw some people complaining about was when searches for white history turned up pictures of black historical figures in Google image results. So this one seemed a bit odd to me, but then I kind of came to the same thought process. Black history is a thing. There's Black History Month, for example. White history, it's not really a concept that makes a ton of sense to me. That's not something I'd heard about. White history is just history. For a long time, that was the only history anyone really talked about. So white history is kind of the default. So to quantify the word history with white was sort of like talking about men's voting rights or something like that. It seemed a bit strange to me. So I would on some level expect there to be some images related to black history on a search for white history, because any context of race plus history, be it black or white, is likely to somehow relate to racism or a racial issue of some kind. So indeed, when you click through on any of these images that are found when you search for white history, Google image search usually has the word white somewhere in the description. So for example, a photo of a number of black slaves sitting on a porch had the caption, "History of Slavery, White Women Were Not Passive Bystanders" by Vox. A photo of two black men, W.E. Du Bois and James Baldwin, with the caption, "White History Month, debate why the concept of whiteness is important to understand." So they go on like this. The words history and white are not used in a vacuum outside of the concept of race. So it makes sense to see pictures of black people when you're looking at white history. But again, I wanted sort of a control. So I did a DuckDuckGo search with the word white history, and it turned up a bunch of weird white nationalist type things with things like White History Month. And a lot of these ended up being jokes, but people basically were mocking the concept of White History Month, sort of in contrast to Black History Month, which is a real thing, an important thing, and a serious thing. These don't appear in Google searches, so there may have been some attempt to avoid those particular results. But it's not as if the history of white people is generally hard to find and classified legitimately as white history by anyone reasonable. So if you want to find out the history of any specific country, you can just look up the history of that specific country or that event. You're not necessarily going to just have those results replaced with black history anytime. Now, a note on Google and race, when trying to find some sources on those inconsistent results, I did find some older articles talking about issues with Google results. So it seems like they have tweaked some of their algorithms to avoid what appeared to be racist search results in the past. So one example was an article claiming that searches for black girl turned up largely sexualized results, although that article did also mention that searching for white girl or any other sort of girl gave the same kind of idea. There are also some bad autocomplete results when users would type "why are black" in a Google search bar. A few years back, it would give suggestions like "why are black people so loud?" or "why are black better athletes?" So Google isn't really going out of their way to have biased results, but these are just a reflection of what people are searching. This just demonstrates that racist data would lead to racist algorithm results. If racist people exist in the world, this will mean that algorithms learning from all people, which will include some racist people and racist data, will exist. So Google has done some work to attempt to mitigate this, which could be a factor in some of the results mentioned. Because we don't know exactly how those algorithms work, it's hard to tell exactly what's going on. So today, if I put the words "why are black" in a Google search box, the autocompletes are all fairly innocuous. So they have things like, "why are black cats unlucky?" Black cats aren't unlucky. It's not even a valid question, but whatever. "Why are black rhinos in danger?" And the only one in the top 10 results which relates to race is "why are black people in Bridgerton?" And this seems to be a TV show based in 18th century London, which, unlike the 18th century London of the real world, has a large proportion of black people belonging to British high society. So finally, one I encountered last week was Google searches for the term blue anon. So what is blue anon? And this is surely a term I would never have heard of if Google's algorithms weren't hiding it. So it seems to be the supposed Streisand effect in action. So side note, I don't know if the Streisand effect, where attempting to hide or censor something brings attention to it, is necessarily real, but that's something perhaps for another segment. That said, Dr. Seuss really is popular this week, and people are buying his books. So, blue anon is this concept of a left-wing equivalent to QAnon. QAnon being conservative conspiracies about all sorts of weird things, Pizzagate and things like that. So conservatives are calling out left-wing conspiracies as being blue anon and trying to draw some equivalency to the left calling out right-wing conspiracies as being QAnon. So examples of so-called conspiracies which are blue anon, so aligned with left-wing politics, would be the Russia hoax, Jussie Smollett, so that was basically an actor who manufactured a hate crime by staging actors to attack him, Ukraine hoax, Covington kids hoax, so we talked about this on the show. The story is generally misrepresented by almost everybody. Brett Kavanaugh, and I'm not gonna get into all of these. That's kind of out of scope, but this is generally the idea. The people accusing the left of believing in these conspiracies believe them to be unfounded. So it's meant to be like an analog to QAnon. Personally, I might have thrown post office stuff in there, but whatever. It's not a term that I'm going to be throwing around, so that doesn't really matter. I think it suggests a bit of a false equivalence between the right and the left. So indeed, there are idiots on both sides, as they say. But to suggest that both are sort of equal in their level of conspiracy isn't really justified. The problems on the left and the right may sometimes have superficial similarities, but generally each have their own distinct set of problems, which vary in intensity for a lot of reasons. So the right and the left may cancel things or deny science, but that doesn't mean that they do so in equal amounts, just like they don't believe in conspiracies in equal amounts, even if they both do in some sense. So much to say. If you do a Google search for blue anon, this newish term, you will find, as of March 9th, when I was putting this together, the first 5 results are for Anon ski goggles, which use blue lenses. So again, the words blue and anon are in there. This is a real result. But them being at the top, on the whole first page of results, the top 10, the 7th actually mentions blue anon, and this is an article for Newsweek saying, "What is blue anon? Urban Dictionary restores phrase for left-wing conspiracy theories." And that was the only one on the whole first page. Meanwhile, a DuckDuckGo search for blue anon gives only results referencing the term blue anon, the political conspiracy term, which currently is mostly about censorship about that term. So a couple of days ago, I refined my Google search to blue anon conspiracy, and humorously enough, every single result actually gave QAnon links. So it was like they were ignoring the word blue. So if you look for anon conspiracy, not factoring in the blue anon idea, it's going to find nothing but QAnon. Now, this is no longer the case. On Google right now, it returns articles about blue anon with other QAnon-related links, such as the second result being QAnon, not blue anon. So, did Google modify their algorithm based on the bad press they'd gotten, or is this organic change based on people using the search engine and actually interacting with those results more? I don't know. Google doesn't have a transparent algorithm, and that's one reason I like to use DuckDuckGo. And there are other reasons that I like to use DuckDuckGo. Now, I'm open to the idea that this may be some quirk of the algorithm, with Google prioritizing actual products such as snowboarding gear because it's in the business of selling things. But I don't know. And if that's the case, it means Google is kind of terrible. Like, it did a bad job here. Not terrible as in bad morally, but just like it's not a good search engine because you're trying to find a thing and it's not finding it. It's not matching it correctly. Yahoo and Bing both returned a lot of relevant links when searching for blue anon. So it looks like Google is either intentionally skewing those results, or in this case, it's just failing its primary job as a search engine. Both could be true in some amounts. Are algorithms biased? Yes and no. Algorithms reflect the data they are created with, and that data can have a bias, or even if it doesn't, there may be some other kind of bias. Introducing constraints on these algorithms can arguably make it more biased, but may ultimately lead to a more desirable outcome, depending what you're going for. The Twitter cropping algorithm doesn't seem to consistently favor white over black faces, but as long as it does sometime, that's enough to make it unpopular. Google results for white men or white history may be the result of changes that Google has done for race-related searches, but I haven't seen any definitive proof of that. Finally, I do suspect that Google is intentionally avoiding matching results for blue anon content, but alternatively, the reason may simply be that it's not a very good search engine. I don't have the answer to that. Peace out, cuboids.
For show notes or to discuss this episode, visit our Facebook page and website at trcpodcast.com. For general inquiries or to send a topic or parody suggestion, email info@trcpodcast.com. Help support the show by leaving a review on iTunes and liking us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter at TRC_podcast.
Outtakes.
I hope everyone out there is staying safe and healthy, and we will talk to you soon.
What do I say again? I forgot.